analyst, U.S. Republican strategist Greg Swenson joins me now from London. Greg, glad to have you join me. Humble beginnings, peanut farmer, largest living former president of the U.S., Jimmy Carter from Georgia, dies 800. Talk to us about his humble beginnings.
Yeah, it's a great American story, and it's really something that we should all look to for inspiration. He started out, basically poor, living in rural Georgia, and somehow, got an education and ended up applying to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis and became a cadet and graduated from Annapolis right as World War II was ending, and served his country, quite proudly. So he was one of the many presidents that we've had from the greatest generation, the men who fought in World War II. And so it was a really great story. And then after the military, after his service, he started a peanut farm in Georgia and learned how to run a business. And I think that was very useful for him when he was president, when he worked on deregulation and economic growth. So it's a really great story.
Interesting. We cannot forget the Camp David Accord. For 2 weeks, himself, Sadat, and Menachem Begin of Israel, locked themselves up to iron out a peace accord where both of them, you could say, was a win-win. You want to discuss the peace accord that he engineered?
Yeah, I think that was probably his foreign policy highlight, because he had so many hurdles to jump and a lot of difficulties in foreign policy. He's in retrospect, it was not a great term, his only term as president. And so the Camp David Accords, I think, were probably the highlight. He ran into a lot of difficulty because the Soviet Union was expanding in his 4 years as president. You had the invasion of Afghanistan by the Russians. Then you had of course, the Iran hostage crisis. And unfortunately, in many ways, he was just unlucky. He had put together a rescue mission to rescue the hostages from Tehran. And unfortunately, the mission failed and helicopters crashed in the desert. And again, I think in many ways, it was just bad luck. And so many of the hurdles and the challenges that President Carter had weren't really of his own making. He, in some ways, inherited inflation. Inflation was a problem for Nixon and Ford. And so it's not that he caused the inflation. He might not have handled it perfectly, but in many ways, like Iran, like inflation, like the energy crisis that he faced, those were all things that existed already when he took office. Unfortunately for him, he made some bad decisions, and that's why he lost in a landslide. Rare to see an incumbent president lose 44 states, but that was the challenge, one of the many challenges that President Carter had.
All right, now you've mentioned Iran. I'll get back and talk about China, but now you've mentioned Iran. He left office 20th January 1981. But he was still negotiating behind the scenes the 20 hostages who were also released on that day. That was interesting.
Sure, and I think in many ways for the mullahs, the new leadership in Iran, that was the final and ultimate insult to Jimmy Carter by releasing the hostages only as President Reagan was being inaugurated. So I think it might have been more their fear of what Reagan might do rather than the negotiating that Jimmy Carter was doing, because it had gone on for 444 days. And so I think, well over a year, obviously. So I think that was a very difficult moment. Again, I don't blame Jimmy Carter for that. And I think in many respects, it could have happened to any president. But, the revolution in Iran, I thought, he got some criticism for abandoning, so to speak, the Shah of Iran, but also got a lot of criticism for supporting the Shah of Iran. So it was kind of a no-win situation at the time in 1979 and early 1980. But surely that was one of the reasons he lost so badly in his re-election campaign in 1980.
All right. Before we continue this discussion on Jimmy Carter, 100 years demise, and then, of course, the homelessness in America. Just breaking the fact that a federal appeals court upheld the jury's verdict finding Donald Trump sexually abused writer E. Jean Carroll and denied his request for a new trial. your, you know, let's get to hear your opinion on this, your views.
I'm not surprised. I'm not shocked. I'm surprised they even went to try to get the case overturned. I mean, this is something that happened allegedly 20, 30 years ago. It was a bit of a stretch from the legal perspective, but you know that it doesn't surprise me that the case was not overturned. And there's real, you know, this falls into the basket of lawfare that occurred over the last 2 years, where you had, you know, several federal indictments, several New York State cases, whether they were criminal or civil. And so, you know, it's been a massive effort to sort of get Trump indicted or push back against Trump during the years where he was out of office. It didn't work. If anything, in many ways, it backfired on the Democrats who were prosecuting him in so many different venues. So I'm not surprised with the outcome, but it's too late it's too late to affect the election, obviously. And again, I think in many ways it backfired.
Well, they said, given the strength of Carroll's case, they are not persuaded Trump's rights were affected to warrant a new trial, because Trump had to go to court, so apparently he didn't get what he wanted there. China calls Jimmy Carter a friend because of his diplomacy in bringing China and America together. I mean, he thawed the eyes concerning their relationships, Greg.
Yeah, look, it was part of a move, a real effort by the U.S., starting with Nixon. It was probably one of Nixon's greatest legacies that he opened up relations with China. Jimmy Carter continued that and made many improvements. It wasn't until later, it wasn't until probably well into the 2000s that the U.S. became, you know, a little bit more suspicious or cynical about what China was doing. The great hope for Jimmy Carter, as well as Nixon, but especially Jimmy Carter, was that by opening up to China, by encouraging them to liberalize trade, to liberalize their economy, they would become more Western-like. They would become more of a lean toward democracy rather than communism and authoritarianism. And it turns out we were wrong, but I surely wouldn't blame Carter or Nixon for that. The intentions were very good. It just hasn't really turned out the way that we had hoped back in the 70s.
His son, Chip, said, and I quote, "My father was a hero, not only to me, but to everyone who believes in peace, human rights, and unselfish love." Speak to us about his Nobel Peace Prize award, along with, of course, Sadat and Begin.
Yeah, I mean, look, that was a great accomplishment at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't end well for Anwar Sadat because some of the extremists in both sides were disappointed that any accommodations or any peace settlement was made. And so, but I would point to it as a great effort at peace, and it continued after Jimmy Carter left the White House. And he continued on after his presidency in so much charitable work, so much diplomacy. So, he did a lot for healthcare in the developing world, which I thought was great. He did make some mistakes. I think he had some missteps where he perhaps went overboard acting as a diplomat for the United States when he was not in the position to do that. I think he in a way got caught speeding with North Korea when Bill Clinton was president. He basically made a deal with the North Koreans without the blessing of the Clinton administration, and yet Bill Clinton felt forced into accepting it, and that probably accelerated the ability of the North Koreans to develop nuclear weapons. So I think that was probably one moment where he overstepped, and of course he was very much against the first Iraq War, so-called Desert Storm, and really in many ways disappointed Americans by getting involved and trying to convince some of our allies in that great coalition in 1991 to basically step away or back away from the United States coalition. That was not something that you'd want to see an ex-president doing. But if you look at his total work, so much of his diplomatic and charitable work was fantastic. He was an evangelical Christian. He brought that to the White House. He was probably the first president in that century to be really open and advocate for his religious commitment. So yeah, there's one thing you could never say about Jimmy Carter. He was a really good person. You could never say he acted, for his own behalf or selfishly in any way. Unlike a lot of recent presidents, he didn't become a wealthy millionaire after leaving the White House. He was very charitable with Habitat for Humanity and other charities that he was involved with, for the homeless, for people in the developing world. So, you'd have to say that Jimmy Carter was a really good guy.
All right, you've taken the words out of my mouth. Service to humanity has kind of been his driving force, his motivation, and you alluded to that a little bit when you talked about his faith. His faith shaped both the presidency, his presidency, and post-White House. You want to dwell a little bit more on his faith. He said he couldn't help but live that way because of his faith.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, that was important. It was the first, an early stage of the kind of return of Christianity or evangelical Christianity to Washington, to the White House. It was followed by Ronald Reagan, who had a different personality than Carter. Reagan brought back, big fancy state dinners and black ties and gowns. He was a little bit more sociable, but in many ways he continued that sort of religious tradition, and I think that was somewhat unusual for the White House, at least post-war, anyway. So it was he clearly was a Christian at heart. Again, he wasn't perfect. None of us are, but it was nice to see a man so committed to helping others, not just Americans.
Indeed, none of us are. We're just working. All of us are working towards perfection, even in our faith work. Now, let's discuss a little bit about homelessness. What is stoking the rise, 18%? What factors are stoking it, and what has the government done to give shelter to people?
Yeah, it's really a problem. We've had a surge in the last 2 or 3 years of homelessness. It's up 18% in the last 2 years, and that should be really worrying. There's a couple of factors here. There's a couple of things that affect it. One is bad government decision making. In some of the bigger cities, they are so-called sanctuary cities. They've made a dedicated and deliberate decision to welcome illegal migrants to their cities without having the ability to provide housing and jobs and other support for those migrants, but they also protect them from deportation. So it's created a massive increase in illegal migrants in big cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago. For example, in New York, there's well over 400,000 illegal migrants just in the last 2 years. 58,000 of them are convicted felons. So you have an opportunity for a challenge where there's just not enough housing for all of these illegal migrants. And so you have a surge in homelessness. You also have a quite deliberate decision by George Soros-backed district attorneys in cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, again, that have decided not to prosecute felons for their crimes. They reduce these felonies to misdemeanors. So in other words, there's no criminal outcome or any sort of outcome for violating the law and living on the street or urinating on the street, et cetera. And same with shoplifting. So shoplifting under $950 has been reduced to a misdemeanor. So there's all these deliberate decisions that have enabled homelessness to increase. And then, of course, you have the economic challenges that were caused by inflation, basically. And so you had this rapid surge in government spending in 2021 and 22 with the different bills that were passed by the Biden administration, $7 trillion in new spending. It overstimulated demand. It created inflation. And then, of course, at the same time, you had hostility to the supply side, to the private sector. And that just made it more difficult for people to make ends meet, to pay their rent, to pay their food bills. So between the economic challenges as well as the really poor decision making by local governments and state governments, you've had this surge. I think it's fixable, and I think you'll see a real change in the next, hopefully in the next year or two, as we return to more sensible policies in big American cities.
Well, two things before we let you go. Some positives there. Among military veterans, there's a decrease. And then
Yeah.
in LA also, first in 7 years, there's also a decrease. You want to take that along with what was the latest on the subway incident, the woman who was burnt to death?
Yeah, look, I think it just, again, it's another example of failed policies. If you permit 10 million migrants to cross the border and break the law before they've even, entered the country or settled into the country, you've got a much higher probability of criminal activity. And again, as I said, 58,000 of the migrants, of the 400 plus thousand migrants in New York, are convicted felons. So it shouldn't be a surprise that you have an increase in crime. And then in the case of the subway homicide last week, as well as the killing of Laken Riley at the University of Georgia last year, these are not only illegal migrants, but they're men who've been convicted of crimes and released because the district attorneys don't want to prosecute criminals for the crimes they've committed. And so you have this double whammy, this double effect of a surge in illegal migrants, but a lack of law enforcement. And so with the defund the police movement and the so-called bail reform movement, that's enabled criminals to be released without bail, without being imprisoned or punished. It shouldn't be a surprise that there's an increase in crime. And it's really sad to see that this illegal migrant was able to avoid jail, and at the same time, after being funded by the taxpayers of New York, New York City has spent $6 billion sheltering and providing other support, financial support for the illegal migrants. And yet you have a tragic incident like this where an illegal has killed a completely innocent person.
Thank you, U.S. Republican strategist Greg Swenson, speaking to us from London.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
having
so
me.
much.